But I had this strong memory of being on this farm and my relatives back there, so I fought to become a Wilson, and I asserted my identity as Wilson. It was a difficult time because my mother got very sick when I was 8 and she nearly died. And I became a Tom Sawyer. I just ran around. In the bush I went fishing, and it made me a very good fisherman and a good naturalist. But I'm not as good a fisherman as John Carey. He's a better fisherman than me. But I learned a lot about nature because I went into the rainforest and I walked around. Didn't go to school much there for a while. And I learnt I was on my own in life, and I got quite a sense of responsibility for my actions. So all my life I've had a strong sense that, you know, you've got to be responsible for your actions. Although we're very poor, we lived in a beautiful part of the world, and Helen Allardinas knows this. It was a paradise, there was we had ducks, and we later had chooks and eggs and a vegetable garden. I used to collect mushrooms. I used to go fishing. There was free milk at school. I knew where all the fruit trees were in the backyards of all the houses and the back lanes of all the town. And I used to raid them periodically like an old orangutan, you know, because that was my first lesson in economic botany. I knew when they were coming into season, you know. So and we fished a lot. And I used to fish for protein. I'd catch my fish and I'd cook it on the spot in a naked flame like the Aborigines did. We got oysters and pippies, and then I started to catch mud crabs. So I became a little industrialist, and I had a mud crab cooking and selling regime at the local pub. I'd sell the mud crabs for 3 shillings each, which was quite a lot of money before they closed the pub at 6 o'clock. And that made me self-reliant to buy additional food. My brother went fishing as well, and he'd lived in a tent at one stage at Belmont Caravan Park. And he told me the story. He was given 2 prawns each morning to go and catch lunch. So, you know, he was responsible for getting the family's lunch. Now, temperamentally, I was a nerdy, reflective sort of character, and not necessarily your average child in that respect, and very much attracted to nature. And I think I was a bit like what I call an orphan wallaroo. You know, I'd attach myself to anything that sort of came along. And one of those attachments was parrots. I loved wild parrots. And the other attachment was orchids. I loved orchids. I used to get these things, see them in the forest. And I looked over the back fence of Percy Sheaf's house one day, Paul, and he invited me in and gave me back cuts and what have you, and taught me about plants. I don't remember being asked to write poetry at school, but my first poem was written when I was about 10, and it was called My Bike. And I had a bike that had been cobbled together from junk bits and pieces found at the dump, the local tip at Kings Creek. And it never used to work, it used to break down. I'm riding along the road and it broke down. And I'm walking it home, and 2 of my friends went past and went ting-a-ling and hello, you know. And I felt so humiliated and so shameful that I came home and wrote a poem. And I'm going to read it to you because this is my first remembered poem. And it's called My Bike. And bear in mind there are some pretty dorky words here because it's written by a 10-year-old. Most people have a bike that goes with a peaceful hum, but I have a bike that's always going bung. I like to go for a hike, but hardly ever on bike. Before the 3-mile peg, I've almost lost my head. The handlebars go loose, the wheels they stop to run. It puts me in a noose and makes me feel so dumb. So I begin to wheel along the road to home, to have a jolly good meal and never more to roam. Now, Gwen Kelly's daughter's in this audience today, and Gwen was a very good friend of mine in Armidale and a mentor in my early poetry. And we were talking about writers, and we were reflecting on the fact that I came from an emancipist, working class, you know, hunter-gatherer type farmer fisherman background. So where was the poetry coming from? Because it wasn't part of that sort of cultural tradition. And Gwen had always said to me, there is always someone else. And on my mother's side of the family there was someone else. And this was a character that the aunties also used to talk about. And he was quite a legend. He was a larger-than-life character who was a sort of poet, an orator, an adventurer, an explorer, and later a spy for the British Empire. And he came to a very sticky end. But this man was also a lightning-quick sketch artist. So he used to sketch likenesses of people on blackboards and that. So he was a writer, he was a drawer, an artist. So some of that must have come through. The man was brilliant and flawed, but he gave me a glimmer in the back of my mind that I could be a poet when I grew up. I didn't even know what a poet was, but I had that sort of, approval that I could do this. Now, Bainbridge had a father who was a literate and musical school bushmaster. He was a pioneering bushmaster of South Grafton and the bandmaster as well. He was literate, where most of my great-grandparents were all illiterate. Now, Nelson, it turns out, had been a remittance man who was receiving payments from England virtually all his life. He claimed descent from Horatio Nelson and Emma Hamilton. And this is the family legend, and that the British establishment had hushed it all up and paid him to go away. And all my life I thought, yeah, you know, because it sounded like a B-grade movie to me. And then in the 90s I met a distant cousin who's a Catholic nun who'd heard the same stories and done research on it. And between us we put together a couple of papers on this man. And the story is that Emma had illegitimate twin daughters, and one had been farmed out to a wet nurse called Mrs. Gibson, and the other was put in St Pancras Foundling Hospital. And this child was adopted into a working class family. She was illiterate, but married, and her son was sent to Naval College, the same as Horatius' boys had been. And so that's pretty amazing for the son of a illiterate flunky. He was bullied in Naval College, and he didn't like it. And he was bullied because of the Nelson connection, he said. So he was bought out by the Britain's establishment, and they paid him off and he came to Australia for a new life. Now, if this story is true, then through Nelson's mother, I'm related to Horace Walpole. Now, old Horace was a man of letters. He was a poet, a social historian, and unbeknown to me, he'd set up the first privately owned printing press in England. He published Gray's Elegy, for God's sake. And in 1982, I set up Woodbine Press as a subsidiary of Edwards and Shaw. Old Horace wrote the first Gothic novel in the English language. I wrote a Gothic novel published in 2001. Horace wrote about social history. I've written on the social history of the gardens and the domain. He wrote books on gardening and art, so it's spooky. And I didn't know this in my middle life. I only have picked up on this in later life. Now, back on the farm, I had drawn before I could read or write, and the first painting I ever saw was on the wall of my grandparents' house, and I was absolutely drawn to it, and there's a picture of it in the catalogue. I didn't know what it was, but it turns out they'd won it in a raffle, the local school, and it was done by a local artist and his name was on the back, and I only found that out in later life. At primary school, there was Gruner's Spring Frost on the wall. Do you remember that one? And I adored that painting. And when I came to the art gallery, I was amazed, you know, how big it was. Massive painting. Those paintings were presented to that school by John Brackenrigg, who was the father of Philip, who owns the Artarmon Galleries, who represent me now in Sydney, which is just, he had married a girl from Kyogle, so that was the local connection. Then I went to Brisbane with my mother to visit her auntie, and I saw the local Queensland Art Gallery, and I came back to say, I'm going to be a painter. And at that stage, I didn't even have any paints at home, so I went to the headmaster and said, I want to learn to paint, can I borrow some paint from the school? And he said, yes, which is pretty amazing. Now, because of my background, coming from this funny farm and going fishing for middle primary school, I was socially awkward. I had poor social skills, and I was probably slightly autistic, but in the high functioning end of the spectrum, I could do things, but I was low in you know, social intelligence. So I had to repeat 6th class, and I was bored stiff sitting there through all these lessons because the teacher would ask the same question at the same place and the same thing. And I had a brilliant memory. I could remember, I knew what he was going to ask, and I put my hand up before he asked the question. So he sort of said, that's enough of that. So he was a very enlightened man, old Bill Bouvray, so he said I could paint up the back of the class. And I did that for the rest of the year. I had a lovely time. I just sat at the back of the class and painted. Now, Helen Laurence is in this room, and Helen was Helen Aladinas then, and I actually painted a boat in her autograph book. Instead of writing my name, I painted a boat. And she was gracious enough to give me that painting about 4 or 5 years ago. And it's in the art catalogue, and I've called it Optimistic Boat. And it's a lovely, happy, it's only about, you know, this big. But I thank you publicly for that gesture. It was very nice. And then I had to leave town. I went to Wardell for the last bit of that year, stayed with my grandparents, and I kept painting. And when my grandmother died, I went to her papers and found she'd saved a lot of the early drawings, but a couple of important paintings from that period, which are in the book as well. I couldn't study art at high school because it wasn't for boys in those days. That's true. I went to the headmaster and said, I want to do art. He said, no. He said, you're bright. You've got to do blah, blah and blah. And it just wasn't on. And the words used were art was for dummies. That was the attitude. So I had no tuition or whatever, but I won the school dust jacket cover award for the intermediate certificate and spent my adult life writing, designing and producing books. So that's sort of a bit spooky too. Carmen Allen, who was the art teacher, lent me some books, and I was blown out of my little mind by them. You know, I'd never seen an art book before like that. Wonderful. I don't want to dwell too much on these details because I know the time is, how's the time now? I'll go for about 40 minutes. 1:30? Okay. Now, Armidale Teachers College was an absolute delight. And Helen was there and Alan Torrens was there. And Alan and I did art as an elective subject with wall placing. And I loved it. And all around the walls were all these beautiful paintings by very good artists of the 1930s in Australia. It was a wonderful regional collection. And I spent my days just wandering around looking at these things. I also studied poetry with Paul Lamb, and that was a delight. And he introduced me to Eliot and Hopkins and Houseman. And it was Houseman that got to me because that was the love, death and sex and suicide back on the farm, and that really struck a chord with me. And I was highly influenced by his Shropshire Lad. And about 20 years later, 30 years later, I wrote The Mullumbimby Kid, and that came directly from the Shropshire Lad. And that was my memoir, book 1, of you know, growing up in the country. Armidale Teachers College was probably the happiest time of my life, apart from retirement. It's hard to measure that, but it was a beautiful time. And it was a time of flowering for me because I literally was a gawky, awkward kid, and I was learning about music. I knew nothing about music, about art, about literature, and of course we did a bit of science as well. Now when I came to Sydney it was pretty awful because I was homesick and I was sort of fish out of water and all of that. And I'd like to thank Alan Torrens here formally, because Alan was a very good friend of mine in those early days because we were two country kids in the city. And I think we met up at the corner of DJ's because there was a college tradition. You went to DJ's on a Saturday morning at 12 noon and you meet up with college people. And Alan turned up one day and I said, "Where are you?" And he said, "Mama," and I said, "Where are you?" So we became very good friends for that time. And it was a good time. But I was incredibly provincial when I look back. And it's hard to imagine what a culture shock the city is to someone who's grown up in a village. And there was the Bob Ellis obituary the other day in the paper, and it was saying about how he was frozen out at Sydney University by the social girls because he was a gawky country kid who walked around in a big coat. And that's true. I mean, I can remember going to social functions, and what used to happen is these very sophisticated ladies, young women, would look down their nose at me and say, "What school did you go to?" And, they're all from Kambala or God knows what else. And then one day I said, "Oh, Lower Wombat Rural School." And they looked at me and said, "Where? What's it? What?" So I gave them vivid descriptions of Lower Wombat, which was a cross between Mullumbimby and Wardell, or East Wardell. Now East Wardell was horrible and flat, Mullumbimby was beautiful, And I had the Nimbin Falls, and so Lower Wombat was down from Nimbin Falls, up from Upper Wombat and all of that. Now, Oliver Bainbridge had been born at Cockmanhurst, which is out in the back of the Clarence. And he was born at Smith's Flat, which is just down from